we'll start with the polarized TID model. So the reason that's become much more popular, and it's certainly fantastic that it has become a lot more popular, and I guess a lot more commonly utilized with endurance athletes of all abilities, is because there was quite a bit of research done through, I guess, largely the Scandinavian countries, whereby they looked at a whole heap of cross-country skiing and winter sport endurance athlete case studies. And the findings from those studies highlighted that a lot of these really successful athletes, so we're talking Olympic gold medalists, when they broke down and analysed their training data, they realised that by and large, the vast majority of their training was spent in the low intensity domain. So, and then when you think about it, it's pretty intuitive. When you think about an endurance athlete that has to train 15, 18, 20, 25 hours a week, there's only a limit as to how intense that exercise can be. They're doing so much work. So through lots and lots of high intensity work, they build up all those central adaptations. And then the other thing that they really found was when they had, by virtue of doing that, they built up a really strong aerobic base, for want of a better term. Then when they flicked the switch and their periodization required them to do some high intensity work, they were able to do that really, really effectively. So that high intensity work then ended up underpinning a lot of their aerobic adaptation. So they were the big drivers for improvements in VO2 max and shifting up those aerobic and anaerobic thresholds that we want to get, and that's where we see a lot of our big improvements. So that the polarized training model, I guess, it's been absolutely popularized because it does stem from a really strong scientific base on not only elite endurance athletes, but it's also been investigated for sub-elite endurance athletes as well. And there's a fantastic study which looked at Ironman triathlon. And my Instagram has covered this particular study by Munoz. And basically they showed that if there's going to be one event which required people to use a threshold model, and we'll cover that one shortly. So the threshold is the most common model. So that's the one where you spend all your time in that moderate or zone 2. Essentially, if that whole event is basically spent in the threshold zone. So sport specificity or event specificity would require you to train in zone 2. But counterintuitively, their research showed that athletes that spent more time in zone 1 and less in zone 2 performed better in Ironman triathlons. So it just shows you the power of spending more time in zone 1. So that's why I think more and more people are spending or investing time in the polarized model. And then that does leave, it does require you to spend a bit more time in that zone 3 zone to make that polarized training work. Now, you have already alluded to one potential issue with the polarized model. So when you try and practically apply it in the field, it's pretty hard to get your heart rate from zone 1 to zone 3 with not spending any time in zone 2. So the whole adage of 80-20 is really hard to apply practically. So for me, there's another model called the Pyramidal Model. And again, I sort of can try and draw it for you, but essentially it's lots of time in zone 3, and then zone 1 rather, lots of time in zone 1, and then it gradually trickles down. So there's less time in zone 2 and then less time in zone 3. Now, the reason I like that model and the reason I think it's really effective is because it still emphasizes zone 1 time. So there's still a massive emphasis on making your easy sessions easy. But what it does do is it provides most athletes with a bit of latitude around their high intensity work. So for a whole host of different factors, sometimes when you try and do your high intensity work, you might be trying as hard as you can, nailing your paces, but for whatever reason, heart rate is a bit suppressed. When you do that, you end up spending a lot of time in zone 2. You might spend a bit of time in zone 3, but you're spending the vast majority of your session in zone 2. That's not bad per se. That's, for whatever reason, fatigue, freshness, it was really cold compared to the warmer conditions when you did the other session the previous week. All of those things have an impact on heart rate response. So I think that pyramidal model is probably more practically applicable in the field, when you're dealing with all those environmental conditions and all of life's stresses. So I think that's a great model to use, and that's one I personally like to implement. And it's not too dissimilar to the polarized model. It is just accounting for a bit more it's probably allowing for a bit more flexibility in that zone 3 execution. What we don't want to see is easy time being redistributed to that moderate zone. We definitely don't want that when we do the pyramidal model.